Social Science. Section 1. Healthcare in the Ancient World. Defining the relationship between health, the theory and practice of medicine, and disease. It can be quite a challenge to pin down any single definition of health that covers all the complexities of what it means to be well. Does it make sense, for instance, for us to define health as the absence of something, namely disease, or do we need to think of it more in terms of what needs to be present in order to consider a person in a state of health? In this resource guide, we'll use the same definition of health that most clinical and social scientists use, which is the definition first published by the World Health Organization, WHO, in 1948, that states, "Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity." Definitions of healthcare terms created in the recent past should be treated with some care when we look to apply them to the more distant past. The main reason for caution here is that the changes to the theory and practice of medicine that occurred towards the end of the 19th century so radically altered our ideas of health and disease that it is tricky to find a single definition that can usefully apply during different periods of medical thought. The WHO definition of health is useful enough due to its broadly inclusive nature, for this definition brings in the mental as well as the physical, the social body as well as the individual body, all of which have had a rich resonance with ideas across the ages. Finding a similarly useful working definition of disease for this guide is somewhat more troublesome, however. This is due to the enormous difference between ancient and modern interpretations of both the nature and causes of disease, the theory of medicine, and how to treat those diseases, the practice of medicine. The actual word disease can perhaps be of help here. It originated from a Middle English word meaning unease. This notion of the discomforted and disturbed individual as one diseased, and showing outward signs of inner trouble resonates across different time periods, including the present one, and so offers a useful definition for us. As we will see later in this guide, however, the influence of scientific medicine, which arose in the latter part of the 19th century, radically realigned medical theory and practice away from where it had traditionally been focused, on patient systems at the bedside, and towards a new emphasis on identifying the specific causes and mechanisms of disease, usually within the context of the laboratory. As we will learn, this shift was immediately controversial and inspired criticisms that continue to echo today. Concerns regarding the proper bedside manner for physicians, as well as the need to provide compassionate care for the whole patient, that is, care for a person beyond their symptoms. Understanding the role of the healer across time and place. When we think of medicine today, we tend to think in terms of hospitals or clinics, and the physicians, nurses, and other licensed healthcare providers who staff them. Just as the germ theory of disease is a relatively recent historical entry into our collective history of healthcare, so too is thinking of this sort of professional medicine as the norm. For most of human history, health and how to promote, preserve, and maintain health was everyone's affair, as it still is today in some ways. Most people would have had at least some practical knowledge of what to do if they had, or someone close to them had fallen ill, though many healing activities, then as now, centered on the home and were often conducted by women as a routine part of domestic labor. In cases where more specialized skills were needed, a healer from the community, someone with specialized knowledge of medicinal herbs, or someone with experience providing aid during difficult childbirths, might be called in to assist the family. So while medicine is an ancient profession with a long academic history, it is important to bear in mind that most healers were not, and many still are not, university-educated and university-degreed physicians. As we shall see, learned physicians did attempt to assert their authority to be the exclusive experts on matters of health and healing, rather frequently during their history, but they were not particularly successful in doing so until the 20th century. A note on the terms science, reason, magic, and superstition. When studying the history of science, technology, and medicine, it is important to recognize our tendencies to prejudge the past by viewing it through the lens of the present, something historians pejoratively refer to as presentism. Unless we are mindful of our presentist assumptions, we are risking severe limitations to our choice and interpretation of historical sources, because it is easy to identify too strongly with those that appear to us to be early examples of the standards and values that we take for granted in modern medicine. Consider the term science itself, which, in its modern sense, is the study of the natural world and the formulation and demonstration of its physical laws. Compared to many of the concepts covered in this resource guide, science is a fairly new invention, only coming into routine use during the latter part of the 19th century. The terms that describe the different branches of science, biology, physics, chemistry, and so on, also date from around that period. An idea or activity that we might see described in a pre-19th century historical source might look to us now, more or less, like a less sophisticated version of modern science. But we should remember that idea or activity would have almost certainly been understood quite differently in previous eras. Before the 19th century, those ideas and activities that, to us, look like science were in fact probably works of natural philosophy, a type of inquiry into the physical world, but one grounded in ancient philosophical systems. Both modern science and modern philosophy are, like the earlier philosophical forms that preceded them, styles of reasoning about the world. It is only quite recently in our history that we have elevated science over philosophy as a more useful and more valuable form of reason. Therefore, to ignore the philosophical elements of these past inquiries and in order to focus on the more familiar, present-like science parts, misses the point of why such studies were likely ever conceived of in the first place and the motives that drove their pursuit. Beyond simply understanding the past, and so the present, better, avoiding presentist assumptions can also help us think about what past lessons might be learned for our future. The current effort in medical education to reimage and revive the humanistic roots of healing is an excellent demonstration of this. Alongside medical educators, historians, and other social scientists are finding ways to understand how current values and ethics in medicine evolve to develop more effective practices for healthcare in the future. One final word of caution with respect to superstition and magic, both of which are terms typically applied in highly judgmental ways to beliefs in the past. The history of medicine has traditionally attempted to trace the rise of secular, rational medicine as distinct from other forms of magico-religious healing. But a comprehensive consideration of past healing traditions will necessarily include explanations and remedies based on what we might interpret as supernatural explanations of disease, that is, based on the relationship between diseases and entities or qualities that today we would perceive to be beyond the natural physical world. Not only have religious beliefs and healing been tightly interwoven for thousands of years, but the boundaries between medicine or science and religion or magic also did not exist in the past as they do today. Practices such as alchemy or astrology, which are considered pseudoscientific by most observers today, were readily integrated into previous medical traditions that were otherwise secular because these occult practices were based in rigorous systematic observation and calculation. As alien as such ideas might seem to the modern observer, in many ways secular medicine cannot be understood independently from its roots in magico-religious thinking. Therefore, it is well worth our time to try to understand what occult practices meant in the past and to learn what we can from them about how we have made sense of ourselves within the terms of health and disease. Patterns of life and death in the past. Health and disease in prehistory. For the most part, we study history by analyzing written sources that, for whatever reason, continue to survive after the period in which they were written. In more recent decades, however, historians have begun to think beyond texts and include in their analysis other aspects of past lives. Such non-textual sources often include cultural practices like folklore and other oral traditions, passing down practical knowledge via stories through the generations, but can also include material culture, the objects of history, including the bones of long-departed people or the artifacts that they made. Relatively recently, historians have attempted to reconstruct those past lives, or elements of life, that cannot be accessed through textual sources alone by borrowing ideas and techniques from sister disciplines like paleontology and archaeology. This is especially important to our understanding of prehistory, the period of human existence that preceded written language. The species Homo sapiens has existed for about 300,000 years, whereas writing was invented about 5,200 years ago. Prehistory is by far the longest period of human history, and it is the one about which we still know the least. We are finding out more and more, however, as the social and the natural sciences come together to assist each other using tools like radioactive isotope dating, spectral analysis of naturally decaying isotopes like carbon-14 to date an object back in time, and visualization and mapping technologies like magnetic resonance imaging, MRI scanners, and geographic information system GIS mapping. History is never done. As we develop new tools of analysis, we find new objects to examine and new ways of seeing previously examined objects. So, what can we say about our prehistoric ancestors from the things, including their own remains, that they left behind? One important area of research, and the one of most interest to us here, is historical demography, or how prehistoric humans lived and died. When we look at the bones of Paleolithic or early Stone Age people, we see that their way of life as hunters and gatherers exposed them to dangerous conditions, harsh climates, and population instability. Hunter-gatherer societies extract all the resources necessary for their survival from the wild, so early hominids would have been forced to travel frequently to find new sources of food, especially as the seasons changed. Frequent travel with uncertain food sources meant tribes and clans had to stay small to survive. Since men did much of the tracking and hunting for large prey, they would have been exposed to significantly higher risks and suffered accordingly shortened lifespans relative to their female counterparts. Older women with their longer lifespans could provide a continuity in leadership and thus likely served as tribal authorities as well as healers. The fossil record has abundant evidence of injuries and trauma, whether by accident or by human or animal attack. But archaeologists lack more extensive knowledge of the diseases that early humans might have commonly experienced. In part, this gap in knowledge is the result of there being relatively few early human fossils at all. Researchers must also contend with the fact that not all diseases leave their traces in archaeological remains. Genetic analysis of modern pathogens, disease-causing organisms, can give us additional clues about the distant past. Using a technique known as the molecular clock calculation, we can use measures of the rates at which genomes develop mutations to estimate a rough date of when organisms began their journey along current evolutionary pathways. This kind of data analysis indicates that some infectious diseases, notably leprosy and tuberculosis, as well as other kinds of diseases that arise from within the body, like cancer, likely affected not only Paleolithic-era hunter-gatherers, but also much earlier pre-human hominids too. In some cases then, the diseases we see in the world today were probably in existence for over 1 million years before Homo sapiens even first appeared on the planet. Civilization and the cradle of disease. According to the paleontological archaeological evidence, the last ice age ended over 10,000 years ago, forcing humans to adapt to the new climate conditions and the altered availability of game animals. In this new Neolithic, later Stone Age, era, nomadic hunter-gatherers increasingly began to make settlements and cultivate the land. It is here in the fossil record that we begin to see dramatic evidence of two things: population growth and a steep increase in the prevalence of infectious disease. Why should this be? First obvious answer is that Neolithic humans experienced population increases as they domesticated wild grasses, from which they produced a more stable and nutritious food source and discovered processes of fermentation. The second answer, which may be less obvious, is related to the first. Humans also domesticated animals, and in doing so created a new way for pathogens to behave in the world. Agriculture and the domestication of animals opened a new chapter in the story of human demography. As Neolithic populations of domesticated cattle, dogs, horses, pigs, and birds increased, zoonosis began to occur with more regularity. Zoonosis refers to the introduction to humans of a disease normally or formerly confined to animal species. After the process of domestication, free-roaming animals lived in increasingly concentrated conditions both with other animals and their human caretakers. The proximity between humans and animals provided conditions that were ideal for zoonotic infections to arise. Scientists have theorized that humans contracted smallpox and tuberculosis from cattle, measles from dogs, rhinoviruses, including the common cold, from horses, and influenza from pigs and birds. Although hugely important, the domestication of animals was not the only event that encouraged the rise of infectious diseases in the Neolithic period. Early humans' proximity to domestic animals was matched by their proximity to each other. As people began dwelling in more concentrated communities, scientists theorized that a second shift occurred in the biological makeup of pathogens. Pathogens adapted to become transmissible from person to person without the need for an animal host as a reservoir, storing and replenishing the sources of infection. In other words, many, but not all, infectious diseases also became communicable diseases. Direct contact with the blood, sweat, and other bodily fluids of an infected person created common routes for the transmission of communicable diseases, as did inhaling the fine droplets of airborne sputum expelled in the coughs, sneezes, and sputum of the infected. Fecal matter also proved to be another potent means to transmit communicable diseases between humans, whether from direct contact or the contamination of shared water sources. In this way, humans transmitted numerous diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, hepatitis, and cholera. The budding agricultural practices in the Neolithic period likely also influenced the disease landscape in other ways too. As humans cleared the land of trees and shrubs to allow for more space to plant crops, they would have inadvertently produced more areas of wet and marshy soils that attracted disease-causing mosquitoes. Expanding populations of mosquitoes could have feasted on the blood of people and animals, transmitting the parasites that caused malaria and establishing reservoirs for a disease that remains a global scourge today. The irrigation of farmland also likely gave rise to human infections from waterborne parasites that continue to blight many regions of the world today, with diseases like hookworm, blood flukes, river blindness, elephantiasis, and bilharzia. A new reliance on agriculture led to new practices of large-scale grain storage. As these grain storages grew, they would have likely moldered with infestations of insects, fungal pathogens, and vermin, whose urine and droppings likely carried bacterial diseases like salmonella. Complicating matters further, since early humans did not have the benefit of millennia of selective breeding, the crops they cultivated tended to have small, tough fruits, which would have had limited nutritional value compared to modern crops. Early humans also lacked the sophisticated chemicals, fertilizers, and pesticides that insulate modern crops from annual changes to soil and from insect infestations, so their crops were more likely to fail. Even in successful years, it is likely that many agrarian populations also experienced seasonal hunger periods, particularly in the spring when food stores were depleted and farming work intensified. When crops failed, so did the lives of many who depended on them. The poorest members of society were the most vulnerable to disruptions in crop production since they had less opportunity to secure alternative sources of food. In the latter part of the Neolithic age, we see clear archaeological evidence of such economic and societal stressors in the number of skeletal remains etched by diseases of malnutrition and stunted growth. Despite the larger and more centralized civilizations that agriculture enabled, many lives and people in that period were shorter and sicker than they had ever been in previous generations. As the great cities and empires that shaped the ancient world were beginning to ascend to power in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China, Each of these powerful civilizations was established as a riverine culture, a society that developed in and around the banks, valleys, and deltas of great rivers. Rivers typically flood surrounding lands on a predictable seasonal pattern, a feature that allowed for planned crop irrigations, as well as the regular replenishment of soils from the nutrient-rich silt deposits left behind by floodwaters. The civilizations that emerged from these river deltas exerted themselves as regional superpowers, using their significant resource advantages to establish robust trade networks. Trade not only led to material prosperity, the intellectual and cultural exchanges that flowed along the trade routes brought these cities prestige and garnered them reputations as centers of learning and cultural sophistication. Whereas early agriculture enabled societies to live continuously and stably in one region, trading fostered movement once again, and with a far greater number of people. Yet, with the freer movement of people came the freer movement of pathogens. Once again, a lasting change in the behavior of human hosts created a new selective pressure for biological adaptations in infecting organisms. While humans as a species had likely encountered such a shift earlier when zoonosis opened the world to infectious diseases, this shift would have been much worse had there been significant contact with other humans in large numbers through trade routes and by living in cities, as such contact festered new routes for epidemic diseases. Thus, it is from the period of early antiquity that archaeologists and paleontologists have recorded the first catastrophic death tolls from diseases affecting large geographic areas simultaneously or sequentially. The age of epidemic disease, from the Greek demos meaning people and epi meaning upon, was dawning. Local climate conditions, land use, and animal husbandry practices greatly influence what kind of diseases were most prevalent in any one area of the world. Although epidemic infectious diseases caused steep death rates, they also likely left behind survivors with limited immunity to those diseases. We know from contemporary science that mothers' immunity can be passed in part to infants via breastfeeding, a phenomenon that could explain why former epidemic diseases that impacted entire populations like measles and chickenpox gradually became diseases associated with childhood. Once trade overland and overseas began to accelerate, however, diseases common to one location, that is, endemic diseases, were likely introduced to new conditions and to people with little or no resistance to those diseases, sometimes called virgin populations. A mild disease in one population could transform into a ruinous, recurring plague when visited upon another place and its people. As the geopolitical realities of these emerging civilizations led to yet more increases in migration, trade, and war, pathogens found ways to exploit new niches brought by these new circumstances. So while the great cities of the ancient world were the social cradle from which all civilizations grew, they were also the biological incubators that took older, geographically limited pathogens and transformed their virulence, or capacity to harm, in terrifying ways. It is ironic that civilization granted the potential for greater creativity and productive endeavor, but also introduced an efficient and effective means to suppress those same activities. The desire for human progress locked societies into an uneasy coexistence between the human and the natural worlds, one that requires continued attention and vigilance to the present day. The early textual traditions of medicine. Mesopotamian medicine. One common theme we see in the history of the city is a tendency towards stratification, or social divisions based on specialized skills and knowledge. Freed from the needs of subsistence, not all people were required to work the land to generate enough food. The new cities enabled all manner of creative and human endeavor. We see evidence of this in flourishing of the arts, philosophy, engineering, law, religion, and the systems of healing and medicine dating from this period. Perhaps the most influential development of civilization was the invention of writing that occurred around 5,200 years ago, which represented a new way to organize and administer the growing needs of new centers of civilization. As cities grew wealthier and more populous, they also grew more complex, written language became the primary means through which hierarchies and bureaucracies managed this complexity. The earliest extensive and systematic writings in medicine were a product of Mesopotamian culture, a vast area that included much of what is now present-day Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria, as well as parts of Turkey to the north and parts of Saudi Arabia to the south. It was here that writing itself emerged. Some Mesopotamian pictographs date from the 4th millennium BCE. Additionally, there are some well-preserved examples of cuneiform script, the first known written language. The Sumerians invented this system of writing in the 4th millennium BCE. Cuneiform artifacts survive because of the durable nature of the materials used for the inscriptions. Many cuneiform texts were made from flaked clay, tablets, or, as in the case of the Code of Hammurabi, a code of law dating from around 1750 BCE, the Babylonian period of ancient Mesopotamia, and the most famous of our early examples of this type, carved slabs of stone, also known as stele. The Hammurabi stele, which is now housed in the Louvre Museum in France, is impressively large, standing more than 7 feet tall. It includes over 200 laws for acceptable conduct and contracts made in public life. When it was inscribed, the stele was a visible, direct statement about the power of the state administration. It was a public declaration of law and was meant to be understood as such. The stone on which the laws were written was deliberately carved to resemble a giant index finger pointing up into the air. This is just one way, then, in which written language not only helped establish intricate divisions, bureaucracies, of labor, but also assisted in enforcing and policing those social rules by detailing exactly what the punishments would be for transgressing them. Some of the laws refer to the practice of healing, giving us clues about the likely quite high-profile nature of specialist healers by this time. Overall, the extant records of Mesopotamian healthcare are not particularly extensive, but they provide plenty of insight into this early form of organized medicine. These were clearly scholarly communications meant to record the most intricate aspects of specialized knowledge. We might assume that more commonly understood or easily remembered knowledge would not have been written down as formally, which is an important consideration for historians trying to reconstruct the common sense knowledge of the past. Once recorded, these ideas could then circulate among a community of other scholarly practitioners. Like later textual traditions of medicine, Mesopotamian sources contain advice about the preparation and use of various herbs and plants with which to treat patients, but significantly, they also convey a scrupulous and concerted attempt to understand the world by observing and recording it as closely as possible. Such observations often discussed what we would now consider to be the signs and symptoms of diseases as they were recorded in individual patient cases. Signs, as we might define them today, are more objective indications of a disease state that can be observed about the patient by others, physicians especially, during a medical examination, such as physical appearance or body temperature. Symptoms, by contrast, are defined as the more subjective category of sensations and experiences of illness communicated by the patients themselves, such as pain levels. The pooling of knowledge in this way, made possible by writing, spread through trade, conflict, and migration. This allowed Mesopotamian healers to learn from each other, argue with each other, replicate effective practices, and eschew ineffective ones. All things that modern medical and scientific journals and books continue to work at today. Along with more practical and empirical, derived from observation and experience, advice found in Mesopotamian writings are traces of what we might call medical theory, that is, ideas about how the body functioned in health and sickness and what the nature and causes of diseases might be. Within those kinds of accounts, we see a mingling of what we might now think of as reason and superstition. Recall our earlier discussion regarding the use of these terms. But for Mesopotamians, such clear distinctions did not exist between these two modes of thought. Alongside the plant-based pharmacology of the Mesopotamians, we see descriptions of magical rituals and incantations the speaking of spells, to the gods. To contemporary observers, it may appear strange that ancient cultures regarded some diseases as stemming from natural causes and some from non-natural or supernatural ones. Only recently have historians of medicine and healthcare critically evaluated the use of the term magic within their own scholarship. Although the term itself derives from an ancient Persian word maju, meaning to be able, for example, able to perform special rituals, the term in Western culture took on a condescending and judgmental tone, especially regarding its differences with organized religion, in particular Christianity. Today, most scholars see histories of science, religion, and magic as connected systems united by a common interest in forces, whether natural, spiritual, demonic, or divine, that adherents believed were at work in the world. Unsurprisingly, therefore, we see such an interweaving of the natural and supernatural in the surviving writings and material culture of healthcare theory and practices in ancient Mesopotamia as well as ancient Egypt. Egyptian medicine. The rise of Egyptian civilization began during the 3rd millennium BCE, and our earliest healthcare writings from that culture date from the 2nd millennium BCE. Unlike the baked clay of Mesopotamians, ancient Egyptian texts were recorded on papyri, an early form of woven paper made from the pithy stems of papyrus plants, and in hieroglyphs inscribed on statues, temples, the inner walls of burial chambers within the pyramids, and sarcophagi that contain the mummified remains of the Egyptian elite. We might assume that since the Egyptians practiced mummification, they also practiced dissection, but this was not the case. Social and religious taboos meant that medical studies through dissection were extremely rare in the ancient world. The process of mummification was prescribed at every stage by religious law, and mummification's purpose was not medical but spiritual. It was part of the death rituals intended to assist the departed in crossing the threshold between the natural and supernatural worlds. For the Egyptians, death meant physical and spiritual disintegration. Mummification, spells, and rituals performed for the dead by the living were the means by which the disparate spirits, the Egyptians believed the soul had 3 parts, could hope to navigate the perils of their afterlife journey towards an eventual reunification of body and soul in the land of the dead. Much like the medicine of Mesopotamians, Egyptian healthcare combined supernatural theories and practices of medicine with natural and empirical ones. For the Egyptians, evil spirits could interfere with health in the individual, so spells to defend against this sort of interference were popular. The words of numerous health-restoring spells have been preserved in papyri, records, or inscribed on amulets, items worn or carried by the living, or sewn into the clothes of the dead to provide protection from this malign supernatural force. In addition to this kind of magical medicine, the Egyptians used prayer and rituals surrounding diet and physical activity as part of their efforts to achieve a holistic balance, equilibrium of mind, body, and spirit that they saw as indicative of what it meant to be healthy. Like the great cities of Mesopotamia, Egyptian urban societies were complex and hierarchical, stratified. Healers in both cultures were specialized. Some practitioners performed more religious healing, while others performed services more grounded in the physical and natural world. But most practitioners performed some of both. Many different kinds of healers used surgical instruments, ranging from dental tools to cutting tools, as in the cases of devices used to extract bladder and kidney stones, as well as tools used to treat wounds and accidental injuries. These healers also used medicinal preparations of plants and herbs. These practices are detailed in medical papyri. Indian and Chinese medicine. 2 other centers of civilization that arose in ancient times were similarly river-based, emerging from the Indus Valley in India and the banks of the Yellow River in China. Like their neighbors to the west, both cultures developed specialist roles for learned healers and produced extensive written texts detailing theories about the health of the body and mind, as well as catalogs of common ailments containing speculations on how to identify and treat diseases when they appeared. One way in which the Indian and Chinese medical traditions differed from those of the Mesopotamians and Egyptians was in the durability and influence of their medical systems across time. The Indian system of Ayurveda, meaning the knowledge of life and longevity, whose origins are traced back to as far as about 6000 BCE, is still practiced today, as well as forms of traditional Chinese medicine that developed around the second millennium BCE. Both systems have changed and evolved over time, and both still exchange ideas with modern Western medicine. In Western countries, especially through the mode of alternative or complementary therapies. Like Mesopotamian and Egyptian medicine, Indian and Chinese medicine emphasized health as a state of equilibrium and devoted extensive effort to detailing the practical ways that diet, habit, and lifestyle could influence the maintenance of health. Indian and Chinese medicine differed from that of Mesopotamia and Egypt in that the supernatural played a relatively smaller role in the explanation of health and disease. The Eastern traditions heavily emphasized the body and the physical signs of disease. Both medical traditions developed elaborate notions of how the body normally worked and functioned. The opposing forces of yin and yang in Chinese medicine helped or hindered the natural flow of vital energy or qi in the body, an idea somewhat equivalent to the three dosha, or energies, of the Ayurvedic system. Indian and Chinese medical systems also developed different methods for treating the signs and symptoms of disease. Both Indian and Chinese medical traditions developed empirical responses to the physical manifestations of illness and made extensive use of medicinal plant preparations as well as basic surgery. But Eastern healing also emphasized other types of physical treatment. These included body massage and exercise in India and in traditional Chinese medicine, the practice of acupuncture, using needles to apply pressure in specific energy points in the body, and moxibustion, heat therapy achieved by burning dried plant material or moxa on or near the patient. These practices were guided by the belief that healers could restore health to the sick by rebalancing or rechanneling their natural flows and energies. The philosophical basis of both Indian and Chinese medicine strongly stressed the idea that the body represented a microcosm of the macrocosm, meaning that the body was a smaller version of and controlled by the same forces as the larger universe. Therefore, what was seen in the body correlated to what was seen in the outside world, and vice versa. This was an extremely powerful way to understand and explore the natural world in Western and Eastern civilizations alike. In order to explore this concept more, let us now begin our investigation of the classical age of medicine and the origins of the Western tradition in the writings of the Greeks. Greece and the origins of the Western medical tradition. By the first millennium BCE, the civilizations that would become the civilizations we now collectively refer to as the Greeks were now organizing around the basin of the Aegean Sea, part of the Mediterranean, including the regions of Ionia, now part of modern-day Turkey, and the Peloponnese, now the Greek mainland, as well as many islands dotting the Aegean, Ionian, and Cretan seas. For millennia, classical Greek society has been regarded to as the birthplace of Western civilization itself, and indeed, the forms of politics and democracy, philosophy, mathematics, rhetoric, literature, and theater devised by the ancient Greeks have served as the basis of the identity of the Western world in countless ways. However, it is also important to remember that no culture developed in complete isolation from other cultures. Trade, migration, war, and the pursuit of empire brought exchanges of ideas as well as goods and conquest of territory. Across our collective global history, there has always been an intermingling of different types of thinking and different ways of living in the world, even when some regions, China for example, closed physical and trade borders to outsiders. Western medicine has thus drawn heavily in theory, practice, and substance from traditions around the globe, but nevertheless maintains its own unique origin stories. Homer's Iliad. Our earliest dedicated sources on ancient Greek medical thought date from around 500 BCE, though earlier textual traces of ancient Greek thought more broadly can be found in the epic poetry of Homer. Homer's description of the last stages of the Battle of Troy in the Iliad was recorded around the 8th century BCE. As we might expect from a poem about war, the Iliad contains vivid descriptions of death and injury from battle, including thorough descriptions of physical ailments due not to disease, but rather to fighting itself. Nevertheless, its description of battle wounds and their subsequent treatment, though fictional, give us clues about how actual Greek soldiers were treated. It is worth noting here that the scenes of injury and healing contained in the Iliad are not descriptions of some early form of organized army medical service. In one section, Homer tells of the actions of the healer Iotros Machaon, when the Spartan king Menelaus was wounded by a Trojan arrow. Like the other Greek warriors, and indeed other Greeks, Machaon's principal occupation was that of farmer. He was not a soldier or a physician. Although Machaon was nervous about treating Menelaus' wounds, Homer tells us of his pounding heart as he made his way to where the king lay, he was able to successfully extract the barbed arrow tip. Machaon completes his treatment of the patient by sucking the blood from the wound, presumably to remove poison, and smearing on soothing ointments Chiron had given Machaon's father. So, who was Chiron and who was Machaon's father? Chiron, we know from other sources, was a centaur, a type of creature possessing the upper body of a human and lower body of a horse. To the Greeks, centaurs represented the boundary between the human and natural world, and the somewhat fuzzy or porous nature of that boundary. While some mythological centaurs are identified by their wild, untamed characters, Chiron is notable for being on the other side of the fuzzy line between nature and civilization, in that he is depicted as a scholar and a teacher. Chiron was the adopted son of Apollo, who, among other things, was the god of healing. Chiron learned the use and preparation of medicinal herbs and plants from his father and passed this knowledge on to humans, as we can see in the case of Menelaus' healing. Don't judge my pronunciation of names, okay? This sense of medicine as a type of knowledge based in the natural physical world was to become the central defining characteristic of early medical historians' accounts of the ancient Greek medical tradition. Greek myths routinely invoked divine origins for human skills and human traits perceived as admirable, but those skills and traits were things that happened in or were applied to the natural rather than the supernatural world. Machaon's father, Asclepius, provides us with another example of this. He was the son of Apollo and a mortal woman, Coronis, royal daughter of the mythological kingdom of the Lapiths. Coronis did not survive the birth of Asclepius, and the infant was taken up by Apollo and given over to the centaur Chiron to be raised. Chiron spread his knowledge of healing to the battlefield of Troy, as Asclepius, in his turn, taught Chiron's knowledge to his own son, Machaon. The knowledge of how to treat the king of Sparta's life-threatening injury on the battlefields of Troy might have emerged from divine origins, but in Machaon's hands, healing constituted human skill, a skill, in other words, of the world. Machaon did not pray or utter incantations to Apollo or anyone else as he approached the king. Instead, Homer describes him coming to the side of Menelaus, hesitant and fearful, his heart pounding, and responding to the pressure in a human way. We should take care not to conflate the secularism of the early Greeks with whatever version of secularism we might now understand to be designated by that term. While there are many instances of the gods being present, but not directly involved in human affairs in early Greek writing, there are also instances in which the gods were heavily involved in the action. For instance, the plague described in the Iliad was caused by poisoned arrows firing from the bow of Apollo after he became angry with Agamemnon's misbehavior. This interpretation of disease as punishment for human transgressions by a divine power is not just confined to Homer, of course. It is ubiquitous in the myths, folklore, and religions of the world across all its regions and all its ages. The cult of Asclepius. Though it is now mostly known for its secular and naturalistic orientation, Greek medicine was not without its religious forms of healing or religious healers. In fact, the most influential and widespread form of healing in early Greece was that practiced by the cult of Asclepius, which formed the classical age of Greece around the 5th century BCE and lasted well into the 4th century CE under Roman Empire. the cult so named because its following was a substantial subset of Greek spiritual belief, not to be confused with modern understanding of the cults, grew to be hugely popular. And by around 200 BCE, most major centers of Greek life had built a healing temple, Asclepion, I don't know if that's how you say it, but dedicated to Asclepius. Cultists venerated Asclepius as a god and would sometimes travel long distances to visit an Asclepion to pray, make offerings, and hopefully be cured of their afflictions. Sick individuals would spend the night on temple floors, where they hoped to be visited by Asclepius in their dreams, and either be spontaneously cured or else receive a coded message containing advice about a cure that could be interpreted the following morning by one of the temple's priests. The temples also had staff who would perform other naturalistic healing practices like applying medicaments and performing rudimentary surgery depending on the patient's needs. Statues and other images of Asclepius usually depict him holding a rod of Asclepius, a staff around which is wrapped a single snake, and still today the staff with the snake appears often as part of the medical logos. According to myth, the knowledge of medicine that Asclepius acquired came not only from Chiron, but also as a gift of secret wisdom whispered to him by a snake after Asclepius had done the creature a kindness. Cult followers believed the knowledge of the serpent had allowed Asclepius to become the best of all healers, surpassing the skill of Chiron and even Apollo himself. The rod of Asclepius should not be confused with another common medical logo, the caduceus, a winged staff with two coiled snakes that was the symbol of another ancient Greek healing legend, Hermes Trismegistus. I don't know. Snakes held great symbolic significance in early Greek religious thought. The serpent is one of the older ritualistic symbols, and it continues to appear in the religious texts and faith traditions of most, if not all, of the world's religions today. One major reason for this persistence is that the symbol of the snake is associated with the dualism of good and evil. The venom of the snake might be poison or medicine, or both. Some of the temple complexes were built on a vast scale, and there are some well-preserved sites that still exist today, including two of the most important of the Asclepiae in the ancient world. The sites at Epidaurus in the Greek mainland and a site on the island of Kos in the Aegean Sea. While the temples themselves attracted huge numbers of visitors, Asclepiae were also famous for their gymnasia, their theaters, and their beautiful landscapes and sceneries. They were places to visit to be relieved of the pressures of life. At the temple sites, as was the case in secular forms of Greek medicine, diet, rest, and exercise were all viewed as being central and necessary to a healthy life, and as the primary means by which a sick individual could be restored back to a state of health. The Asclepiae were places where different kinds of medicine, religious and secular, mixed and mingled. Unlike the tightly ordered top-down societies of Mesopotamia and Egypt, the organizational unit in Greek life was a city-state, or polis. The absence of a single authoritarian power meant that Greek life in general and the practice of Greek medicine was much more pluralistic than in many other civilizations. What this meant for development in Greek medicine then was that different forms of medicine existed, and sometimes competed, side by side at places like Epidaurus and Kos, and it was usually in the hands or pockets of patients to decide for themselves which kind of practitioner they wanted to consult. Whereas one patient might prefer to always consult with a practitioner representing one particular view of medicine, another patient might prefer to choose from different styles of practice at different times, depending on what their particular ailment was or what the other needs were. The medical marketplace that developed in the ancient Greek world was a fluid and dynamic one, and this largely remained the status quo in Western medicine until the professional reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Claims from practitioners that their type of medicine was a superior or correct type, however strongly or convincingly made, still had to contend with the similar arguments doubtlessly being made by competing styles of practice, and with the fact that patients themselves did not seem inclined to allow the plural marketplace to die. We will return to this topic of patients' pluralism and the medical marketplace later in this guide. One of the most important of all medical systems to emerge during this period was the one ascribed to the Greek physician Hippocrates, who was born on the island of Kos in the 5th century BCE. Today, Hippocrates is commonly described as the creator of the Western medicine, and this was a legacy that was crafted over time and centuries after his death rather than during Hippocrates' own time and with the man himself. For Hippocrates and his followers living and working on an island renowned for its Asclepion, the promise of future influence was in no way obvious or assured. The realities of existing within a pluralistic marketplace meant that Hippocrates' writings were full of sharp words and polemics against competing ideas and practitioners. Hippocratic medicine as Greek natural philosophy. The Hippocratic writings are the foundational text of the Western medical tradition. The Hippocratic writings, which are ascribed to either to Hippocrates or those he influenced, were principally concerned with explaining the upsets of the body in natural rather than divine terms. Hippocratic writings also devised theories concerning the environmental influence on disease and the means to influence the health of the body by natural interventions. The Hippocratic writings are diffuse and somewhat inconsistent, as might be expected of a body of work produced by multiple authors over a period of a century or more. That said, a dominant theme of the works is the microcosm theory, a view of the body as a microcosm of the greater universe, or macrocosm. This was an idea that was also important to the Indian and Chinese medical systems described earlier. Greek philosophers used the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm to great effect. In the 5th century BCE, the Greek philosopher Empedocles hypothesized that the universe was composed of 4 primary elements: air, earth, fire, and water. Because the microcosm reflected the macrocosm, it followed that the human body was composed and controlled by the same 4 elements, making the body an ideal model to understand the larger forces of the universe. According to the theory of the 4 elements, disease was a state where one element of the body was wielding an outsized influence over the others. Healing, then, was restoring balance to the body by counteracting that element. Though Empedocles thought everything in the universe was composed of those 4 elements, different objects would have differing amounts of each elemental influence. Medicine, then, was a major means to investigate the essential properties of the elemental substances, because it was in patients that physicians could observe how foods or medicines associated with the given element could produce therapeutic effects like heating, moistening, drying, or cooling in the body. The Hippocratics too saw the human body as the natural world, albeit on a smaller scale. Where they differed from other philosophies of the body was in their decidedly empirical and practical outlook. In tradition in medicine, for instance, the author rebukes the elemental theories of Empedocles for being too speculative. For the Hippocratics, exact observation of the individual patient, their symptoms, their response to treatment, and the course and outcome of their disease was the proper object and purpose of medicine, not abstract theory. Therefore, Hippocratic medicine emphasized that the body was not directly composed of the 4 elements, as Empedocles had argued. Rather, the Hippocratics ascribed to the theory of the 4 humors. They thought the body should be understood to be controlled by 4 elemental fluids or humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, which were readily observable and measurable. For the Hippocratics, as with Empedocles, a state of health represented a balance of humors within an individual. As we will see in Section 2, the theory of humoral medicine, which originated in Hippocratic writings, was truly first systemized and organized by later scholars, especially Galen of Pergamon in the 2nd century CE. From the point of view of the Hippocratics themselves, however, humoral medicine was a way of thinking about constitutional health, the usual physical condition of each individual patient, and what they, as physicians, might do to help restore it in case of illness. In order to restore humoral balance, the healer needed to know what health looked like for the individual before they fell ill. Daily lifestyle habits, especially with regard to diet and exercise, and the environment, such as climate, were thought to greatly influence the state of constitutional health, and could also restore it, if practiced properly. Thus, the place of the individual patient in their specific situations and habits was central to the theories and practice of humoral medicine. Naturalism and secularism in the Hippocratic writings. Like other natural philosophers, the Hippocratics saw great value in drawing analogies between aspects of the observable world and what was going on inside the mostly unobservable body. Until the advent of anesthesia and antisepsis in the 19th century, internal surgery was too dangerous, and therefore was limited. Hippocratic works that dealt with the internal structures of the body commonly rested on the kinds of observations made from treating fractures and wounds. While there is a dissection-oriented text included in the Hippocratic writings, the heart is an outlier, and historians now think it was produced at a considerably later date than the other writings. The Hippocratics did make use of some animal dissections, however, and in one of the most famous of all Hippocratic works, on the sacred disease, the author describes investigating the brain of a goat afflicted with the sacred disease, epilepsy, to demonstrate that it was full of fluid and foul-smelling. These observations were then, using analogy, put into the context of broader natural laws. The south wind has the same effect on the earth, the sea, rivers, springs, wells, and everything that grows and contains moisture. In fact, everything contains moisture in a greater or lesser degree, and thus all things feel the effect of the south wind and become dark instead of bright, and warm instead of cool, and moist instead of dry. Jars in the house or in the cellars which contain wine or any other liquid are influenced by the south wind and change their appearance. The south wind also makes the sun, moon, and stars much dimmer than usual. Seeing that such large bodies are overcome and that the human body is made to feel changes of wind, it follows that southerly winds relax the brain and make it flabby, relaxing the blood vessels at the same time. The sacred disease, what we now consider to be epilepsy, was the ideal vehicle with which to make the argument for naturalism and secularism in medicine, because of the intense convulsions, seizures that accompanied epilepsy. Much ancient Greek cultural wisdom suggested it was the result of divine retribution, and a primary vehicle for retribution at that. Accordingly, it was the disease most generally accepted to require the attention of a religious healer. For the Hippocratics to prove that all things had a natural cause, and so all diseases too, they had to explain the sacred disease in natural and secular terms. If natural cause and effect relationships could be established for the sacred disease, then it would follow that natural cause and effect relationships likewise applied to all diseases. This aspect of Hippocratic tradition, that all things will become known through study and in time, is perhaps another way in which the ancient world still echoes in modern science. We now take it for granted that if we do not know the answers, we will know them in the future. We just need to keep working. This is an idea perhaps pithily expressed in the Hippocratic writing titled Aphorisms, the very first of which reads, "Life is short, science is long, opportunity is elusive, experiment is dangerous, judgment is difficult." Hippocratic Ethics. As close observers of the natural world, the Hippocratics had a keen sense of the limits of humankind's power to intervene in cases of disease. For instance, the author of Science of Man states, "I would define medicine as the complete removal of the distress of the sick, the alleviation of the more violent diseases, and the refusal to undertake to cure cases in which the disease has already won the mastery, knowing that everything is not possible to medicine." Such rhetoric helped further distinguish Hippocratic healers from magical religious healers with whom they competed. This kind of rhetoric underscores how these scholars define their success as physicians, that is, as prognosticators, giving help and comfort where possible, but ultimately acting as a guide to the processes of nature. It seems highly desirable that a physician should pay much attention to prognosis, if he is able to tell his patients when he visits them not only about their past and present systems gleaned through the study of similar cases histories that were scrupulously conducted by the Hippocratics, but also to tell them what is going to happen, as well as to fill the details they have omitted. He will increase his reputation as a medical practitioner, and people will have no qualms in putting themselves under his care. Moreover, if he will, the better be able to effect a cure if he can foretell from the present symptoms the future course of the disease. If a physician felt that the disease was far too progressed in a patient, or felt that intervention would likely only make matters worse, then a Hippocratic saw it as that physician's duty not to intervene, an idea from which we get perhaps the most famous of all the Hippocratic maxims, to first do no harm, or as it is stated in the book Epidemics, practice two things in your dealings with disease: either help or do not harm the patient. There are three factors in practice of medicine: the disease, the patient, and the physician. The physician is the servant of the science, and the patient must do what he can to fight the disease with the assistance of the physician. Another Hippocratic text that includes a description of a model for ethical practice is the Hippocratic Oath, in which the moral character and appropriate conduct for the physician are outlined. While this is a critical text for understanding the Western tradition, it is also something of an outlier in the Hippocratic writings themselves, and it became important for reasons that had much more to do with the issues and concerns of later civilizations than with those particular to the time of Hippocrates. For those reasons, we will discuss the Hippocratic Oath when we cover medical medicine in the next section of this resource guide. I refuse to do the summary. Page 26 is where we'll start next if I decide to ever do this again, because this was a terrible idea. Goodbye.